Ronald, the rules lawyer here. I've been planning a video for a while about how some players in the D&D and Pathfinder communities who prefer spellcasters act like spoiled kids. And for people who play Pathfinder have been following the online discussions the last few days, there is some outrage right now saying that the designers of Pathfinder 2e want to nerf spellcasters. I thought putting out that video as I originally planned it would be incendiary. So I'm now going to make that part 2 of a 2-part series, the first of which I will address now with the discussions that are happening. And to clear the record now, the second part is addressed at a broader audience that includes people more familiar with D&D 5e and their expectations of spellcasters and about when they get upset that a non-spellcasting class does one thing better than they do. So, on to part 1 of this series. Is Pathfinder nerfing spellcasters? And the answer is yes. They already nerfed spellcasters compared to first edition Pathfinder, but that's kind of a bad joke. The controversy right now is about a new document that was just released, which is presented as a preview of the next edition, which I call 2.1, called the Pathfinder Remaster, the first part of which will come out this November. By the way, don't miss my in-depth coverage of that PDF document in my recent video. There are a couple of things there, including a certain spell, Produce Flame, from the current version of the game, being replaced with Ignition, which does less damage on average when you look at its ranged version. At the Pathfinder 2e subreddit, there's a very vocal section of people there who are anxious about this, and some of them are saying that the designers aim to weaken spellcasters further, that they hate spellcasters, things like that. And I just have to say that kind of doesn't make sense. That implies a kind of malice on the part of the designers. Yes, they weaken spellcasters to make them in line with marshals when 2e first came out, but the idea that they have this idea of weakening them further just doesn't add up. Also, we have limited info. Mark Seifter, one of the original co-designers of Pathfinder 2e, along with Jessica Redekop, who contributes as a freelancer to Pathfinder, pointed out that this document, which is called the Remaster Core Preview, actually says on the first page that the main purpose of this document is to give you everything you need to use the spells, items, and creatures from the new Rage of Elements books that comes out next week. I'll just put up on my screen one of the monsters in the book that has the spell Ignition. I believe that all of the spells that are included here, there's not a small number of them, consists of all the spells in Rage of Elements that people currently won't recognize. So this is not meant to be a vertical slice of the remaster. It's a tool to tide us over the next few months between the release of Rage of Elements and the remaster being released to be able to use Rage of Elements. They did use this opportunity to explain some more things to look forward to and some of the rationale, particularly about removing alignment and removing the 8 spell schools. And they retitled it Core Preview. So there is kind of some mixed messaging here, which is unfortunate given the freakout currently by some Pathfinder players believing that this is supposed to be a representation of what cantrips will look like in the remaster. There are 2 parts to the present controversy. One is the removing of the 8 traditional schools of magic that are in D&D, and the other is the belief that they are weakening the damage of cantrips. So, on to the first one. Every spell in Pathfinder 2e belongs to one and only one of 8 schools of magic. First, one reason they're being removed is to move away from the SRD and to make themselves super safe from any possibility that Wizards of the Coast will take legal action against RPG publishers who derive their games off of D&D. Now, Paizo wanting to play it safe and breaking from the OGL is understandable, but I think even if that had not happened, the designers have been wanting to do this in order to improve the game. So how does it play out currently? It basically affects the wizard class. Right now, wizards at level 1 choose whether to specialize in one of these 8 schools or to be a universalist. If you choose to be a specialist, you get a bonus spell slot every spell rank the new term for spell level, that can only be filled from a spell of your chosen school. Also, you gain the benefit of a focus spell that is thematic for your school. Focus spells scale with your level, and you get to cast one every combat so long as you can refocus for 10 minutes between each combat. The complaint right now is that the remaster introduces colleges that are meant to replace the 8 arcane schools, and the example that they give has a limited spell list, at least when compared to what one of the 8 schools currently gives you. Here, the School of Mentalism gives you 3 spells at first rank and 2 for most of the other ranks. Compare this to the, looks like 12 enchantment spells that you can get at the first rank right now. Given that there are currently 1,268 spells for Pathfinder 2e, and that if you divide that by 8, the number of schools, it's about 150, 160. Having that number reduced to about 20 is a reduction. Notably, it also says that your GM might allow you to swap or add other spells to your curriculum if they strongly fit the theme. And I'm going to say I'm all for this. First of all, now we get to have more than 8 schools and more than 8 potential focus spells. There's a lot of choices that clerics have for domains just in the core rulebook alone, each with their own unique focus spell. I think we're going to have more choice, if not in the core rulebook, then potentially in the future. However, I think there's a deeper reason for removing the 8 schools. And Mark Seifter, who is one of the co-creators of Pathfinder 2e, talked about it in yesterday's stream, and I'm going to quote him here. I'm just going to go ahead and read the quote. One of the issues with the wizard and the arcane spell list in general is that the wizard, as it was seen specifically in Dungeons & Dragons, does a very good job at blocking a large number of very interesting class concepts and options out of the game, by virtue of being hugely demanding that the wizard must be able to be the expert in everything. He talked about how for first edition Pathfinder, when there were separate spell lists for every class, that freelancers would submit drafts that made that spell available to sorcerers and wizards, and the developers would have to remove that designation sometimes to maintain some balance. But at the same time, there was a fair argument that any spell dealing with undead should be available to a wizard who specializes in necromancy. Basically, historically in D&D, wizards used to be called magic users because they were the magic class. It was the caster. But we're now moving away from that, having more classes that are not the wizard. But now in Pathfinder, as it publishes new classes that use magic, Mark Seifter called wizards and the arcane spell list the green-eyed monster that wanted to gobble everything up. And this has an effect on the design space. So he went on to say, having 8 schools that define all of magic, and then saying that the wizard has a specialist in all 8 of them, not only puts a lot of pressures on the arcane list, but also prevents you from having a class called Necromancer, which is an excellent name for a class, would probably be an excellent class that you could make. And by virtue of removing the school necromancy and then not having wizards specialize in necromancy, now you could. This is also part of how Pathfinder has moved away from the idea that wizards in D&D traditionally can do everything. Pathfinder asks you to specialize. Plus, this also leaves room for other classes to shine. But anyway, that's what part 2 is about. And as I brought up in my review of the PDF, the fact that Pathfinder divides all spells into the 4 magical traditions, and they want to keep them relatively balanced with each other, while also pleasing the green-eyed monster of the arcane spell list, and keeping the 8 schools balanced with each other, taking all of that into account, it seems like it subtracts more than it adds. So back to what's being complained about. Well, first of all, I don't know how much of this is truly felt by some of the people being loud online, because my sense was that spellcasting players were fine with this change in the previous previews, where it was already pretty clear that the colleges that would be replacing the 8 schools would be more limited and narrow. I think this is blown up now because of the anger about the second issue, which I'll get to. But I think that the complaints that are happening right now about this, having to choose one of these 3 spells as opposed to 12, are overblown. Because let's step back here. If you want unmatched flexibility as a wizard, don't specialize in a school. You can be the universalist wizard who, moreover, if it retains this ability from the current edition, you can have an extra casting of one of your prepared spells in each spell rank once per day. That essentially gives you almost the same number of spell castings that specialists have, but with more flexibility. As of now, those who want to play a specialist wizard are complaining that they're not able to get a bonus prepared spell per spell rank, plus have a focus spell from their school that universalist wizards cannot get, plus have the opportunity to choose from a large number of spells for their quote-unquote specialist bonus spell slot. Now let's look at the School of Mentalism. This is our narrowing of the current School of Enchantment. This school is focused on the arts of befuddling lesser minds with figments and illusions or implanted sensations and memories. That sounds awesome. And that sounds pretty broad. And it says that the GM might allow you, yes, might, but really, you'd have a completely sound argument to say that a spell called Befuddle, which is not here under the School of Mentalism, would fit under befuddling lesser minds. And I'm sure there's other spells which you can make a strong case for. And really, are we complaining about having dizzying colors, which is probably color spray? That's a great spell. Then I surveyed the enchantment spells that might be competing with dizzying colors. It looked to me like pretty much everything could kind of qualify for the School of Mentalism and what is described here. If I were the GM, I would allow them to substitute one of their choice, not add. However, synchronized steps and the idea of making 2 allies work better in tandem did not seem to fit the theme. But anyway, this is about having your specialist slot be focused on 3 spells, which are the ones that are kind of your signature spells, instead of being another very flexible slot. Now, if you wanted to prepare synchronized steps, you have your other spell slots. You have your unrestricted spell slots to prepare that spell. This just seems like an overblown complaint. Again, if you want to not worry about whether your spell in this slot comes from a particular list, become a universalist wizard. In the meantime, you have the boon of having more spells prepared per spell rank and having a focus spell that the universalist wizard does not get. And if you did want the idea of having your allies work together, why did you choose the mentalist school then? You can, maybe there's another college in the core rulebook that's more appropriate for this, that this would completely fit in with. Maybe not. But even if there isn't, nothing stops a GM and a player from coming up with a school that accommodates the theme the player is going for. That's precisely what people do with backgrounds in Pathfinder 2e currently all the time. Because the structure is right here. Curriculum, a number of spells at each spell rank, and 2 school spells. Now, granted, you might have to borrow from the school spells that are provided in the remaster, but you also can probably use the ones from the core rulebook without problem. Also, the GM probably should consider the rarity tag and not let you pick 5 uncommon and 3 rare spells. But as of now, the complaint about this school being limiting is like complaining about backgrounds and complaining that there isn't a particular background for your character concept. My character's having a midlife crisis, but there is no midlife crisis background. The solution is obvious. Talk to your GM. And just as Pathfinder players and GMs prefer having defined rules so that if we homebrew our own things, we have a clear model of how to do them easily and in a balanced way, so we do with colleges. And I'm sure that tables will come up with their own edicts and anathema. The rules in a tabletop game are tools for getting the experience our particular tables want. And when building your character, they're tools to help you define your character, make it fit your concept. They don't have to constrain you. Anyway, this whole thing is a tempest in a teacup. Okay, on to the next controversy, the bigger one. So it basically breaks down to comparing the damage of the ranged version of Ignition with the current version of the spell We go from 1d4 plus your spellcasting ability modifier, which is almost certainly going to be 4 if you maxed out your main attribute, to 2d4 damage. The average is decidedly less. Also, we get confirmation from the designers that your spellcasting ability modifier will not be added anymore to spells starting with the Remaster Core books. Also, we get the addition that if you use this as a melee attack, your dice increase to d6s, and with every increase in spell rank, you add 1 more die. Before I break down this argument and say what I think it's important to remember the main strength of spellcasters in Pathfinder 2e, which is not dealing damage. It's to be an indispensable part of your team that has the right tool for the job. Recently, in one of my streaming campaigns, all of the players are playing martial characters, with the exception of one who played a bard who was absent that day. So his character had to be controlled by one of the other players. And when he cast Maze, which removed an enemy from the battlefield without a saving throw, this was his reaction. The guy in the top right is the person controlling the bard.
Okay, no save, it's gone, right?
What? Oh, I thought there was
save.
Yeah, it takes checks to get out of the maze. This is one nod to the past.
Right.
This spell.
That's why it's so strong. Holy cow! Yeah, conspiratorial is out. I'm just. Whoa! Is this what it's like to be a spellcaster?
Okay, I just had to play that because we got to keep perspective and remember the varied strengths of the spellcasting class. And furthermore, the idea being expressed right now that Paizo is planning to weaken casters. First of all, we don't know that yet, and I don't think they are, but it just doesn't make sense. It just doesn't add up. Yes, Paizo probably should communicate better about what they're trying to do with Ignition right now, but I think people would be incorrect in jumping to conclusions. But they would be correct in saying and asking for a clarification. So on the Roll for Combat stream yesterday, Mark Seifter, co-designer of Pathfinder, who now works with Roll for Combat, he also dismisses out of hand the idea that they want to weaken caster damage and believes that the goal is to remove spellcasting modifiers from spell damage formulas so that they can be used more easily, be more consistent with each other, and scale correctly. The formula is 2 dice at rank 1 and 1 additional die at each additional rank. Also, I don't think they're trying to weaken spellcasters because of a spell that they pointed out in stream from the new Rage of Elements book. It's right here. It's called Needle Darts. It's available to all spellcasters, all the spell traditions, and it does 3d4 piercing damage and can possibly do persistent bleeding damage, and it has a long range for a spell of 60 feet. This is currently slightly better than the current go-to single-target range tank cantrip of choice called Telekinetic Projectile. Slightly more damage and twice the range. This is a buff for divine spellcasters for whom there's been a complaint that there hasn't been a reliable damage cantrip. And this cantrip will almost certainly not be substituted or replaced with the remaster. And it also needs to be said, too, that nothing necessarily precludes using the old produced flame at a table that is using the remaster. It would be completely understandable for a GM to exclude the core rulebook and advanced player's guide and stick to the remaster material only. But almost certainly that GM would allow the whole gamut of books that have been released since, with spells like Needle Darts, the other rule books like Secrets of Magic that has plenty of spells, and all of the options in those books in a remaster game. We have no confirmation that any of the spells from previously cannot be used in a remaster game. It's just that the revising spells with new names, and yes, sometimes with some modifications, in this and future publications because of the OGL. The other thing we see is that with Ignition, that there actually is a slight damage increase for attacking with it in melee. Not only is there a slight, very slight advantage at rank 1, but it's outright going to scale better than the current version at higher ranks. This is an excellent option for a Magus to deliver with their spell strike. And if anything, the go-to spell for that purpose right now in the meta, Gouging Claw, is somewhat surpassed by this because it also does d6s of damage, and if they have a weakness to fire, which is much more common, it can trigger that every round on a crit. What I'm guessing they're doing, which they said during their stream during PaizoCon, was that they wanted to have cantrips present an interesting set of options, which I think already was somewhat of a design goal in the original core rulebook. Because when you look at the cantrips from the core rulebook, they are each situational. And we should be mindful of the fact that if a caster wants to do damage with their cantrips, they have 5 cantrip slots to prepare those cantrips with. So we're not talking about their one damage cantrip of Produce Flame being replaced with Ignition. We're talking about a revision to one of the tools you can have in your toolbox when going out on an adventuring day. So Electric Arc has the advantage of targeting 2 creatures, of calling for a saving throw, which still damages a creature if they succeed on their save, but don't critically succeed. Of course, it does electricity damage. Each of these does its own kind of damage, which might trigger a weakness. Electric Arc is for pure DPR if you want to do lots of damage, because you can target 2 creatures. And by targeting a save, it doesn't contribute to your multiple attack penalty or get penalized by it. It's a perfect complement to a bow shot. Telekinetic Projectile has the advantage of having a d6 of damage. It scales better than Electric Arc. It doesn't attack 2 targets the way Electric Arc does, but you can choose between one of 3 types of damage. Also, it's available to occult spellcasters, whereas Electric Arc is not. Ray of Frost, in addition to doing cold damage, is the cantrip with the great range that you choose if you want to affect something from far away, which can also slow down their speed as they try to approach you if they're a melee enemy that's particularly effective against them. And along this theme, at PaizoCon they talked about a new cantrip called Frostbite, which if the creature critically fails their saving throw, they get weakness to bludgeoning damage, which can be used in tandem with martial characters using a bludgeoning weapon or just punching it to death. We get a field of cantrips that are interesting in their diversity. Woe are we if we find the cantrip to rule them all that we use as a rotation. And let's be real, Produce Flame was never used for its DPR. I don't know any table or any caster who uses it for its damage, because currently it only does a d4 to 1 target. The criticism levied against Ignition is its ranged DPR, but everybody who can cast Ignition is better off for ranged DPR to use Electric Arc or Telekinetic Projectile right now. And we can now add Needle Darts to that list. You would only use it if you want to trigger some weakness to fire damage. Now I'm going to say something provocative. On the one hand, you have less ranged damage with Ignition. However, this spell was never intended to be your ranged DPR go-to. In the context of the overall tool set that you as a spellcaster can have, and that you can prepare 5 cantrips every morning, this is a buff to spellcasters. Because now you have another option to do a d6 of damage in melee, just like with Gouging Claw, that is not limited to physical damage. It does fire damage, which a number of creatures have a significant weakness to, and that can be persistent fire damage on a crit. That's the situational value of this cantrip among the other cantrips. It's to target weaknesses, turn off a troll's regeneration, what have you. In the end, having 1 to 2 points less of ranged DPR with a spell that is hardly used ever for ranged DPR is not a big deal. All that said, I am not 100% convinced we're at a happy place right now in the game with regard to low-level play for spellcasters. This is where some of the comments I've read do raise what I think is a valid concern, because the prevailing advice that many people give, that I give to new players, is to start at level 1. These are the levels, the formative levels, at which people will make their impression of the system. And especially for people who enjoy casters from other editions and come in with a set of expectations of what they can do. And casters are very powerful in D&D 5e, definitely. They can do a whole set of things, and if built right, can outdamage martial characters. Many such players will be coming to Pathfinder 2e not to create the toolbox, which is the strength of the caster in the system, but will be focused on damage and are looking for that Eldritch Blast, that cantrip that can do a satisfying amount of damage at will. The fact that Ignition, when used in melee, has a d6 and therefore scales better at higher levels does not help the low-level caster. Also, my speculation from my last video that the possible weakening of damage for cantrips in the remaster, which I no longer believe, might be compensated for with the ability to cast more focus spells more often, because you can get all your focus spells back now under the remaster. But that doesn't help the low-level character. Nearly every first-level character, if they have a focus point at all, will have only one focus point, so they won't benefit from the rule change. If anything, what's more concerning is the potential weakening of Electric Arc, which will move from doing 1d4 plus your spellcasting mod to up to 2 creatures to 2d4. That will be lessening your damage on this spell. There has been a complaint among some circles that Electric Arc is too much of an auto pick. It simply outclasses the other cantrips, and Mark Seifter said that on his stream, and they knew that it did when they put it in the book. It lets you target 2 creatures who can be far apart from each other, does a decent amount of damage, and it does partial damage even when they succeed on their saving throw. It's an excellent spell for mopping up creatures that are at very low health. But it's also a really good spell when they're at high health. It's kind of been the fallback for a lot of new players, new to Pathfinder 2e. The one shining moment when they get frustrated by what their spell slots are doing. It's less than what they're used to if they come from 5e or first edition Pathfinder. Electric Arc is that kind of moment where they're like, oh, I'm not as weak as I thought I was initially. Now I would say it's becoming more balanced in that it's not going to outclass Telekinetic Projectile in pure DPR, but that is the go-to spell for a single target. This is what you use for 2 targets. It has its own niche. I personally kind of like that it's not an auto pick as much for nearly all situations. But again, my concern is that experience of the new player, or just the player overall who's trying to figure out how to leverage the strengths of the class. So that's my last reservation. I do hope that we'll be given tools to make the initial experience of Pathfinder 2e gentler for not just casters, but all players of the system. This has come up in my own campaigns where at level 1, you don't have a whole lot of hit points, and a knockout can lead to a vicious cycle. Mark Seifter brought up in a recent stream the possibility of giving extra hit points at level 1, which I think would be great to insert in the remaster, either in the book or as an unofficial suggestion outside the book for new groups, to have some extra hit points at level 1, and then to lower how many hit points you gain after that until you get back to the norm. In the meantime, spellcasters at these first levels will need to follow some guidelines that I'm going to cover in one of my videos from my law school series. To some extent, Pathfinder 2e does preserve some of the tradition in D&D that spellcasters are weaker at lower levels and can look forward to having some great power at higher levels, for good or ill. And personally, I kind of like that, and there definitely are some showstoppers later on, like slow synesthesia and chain lightning, but I understand that's not everybody's preference, and I get it. Plus, my main concern is that experience, that formative first impression for new players. So, some final thoughts. I think Paizo should have expected this freakout and probably should have presented better what this document was, and probably narrowed its focus to being a tool to use Rage of Elements now. Hopefully they'll respond to a lot of the anxiety right now at Gen Con. That's kind of what I wanted to say on this topic, and in part 2 I will go to my original plan and talk about casters, the players of casters, some of them in D&D and Pathfinder, not being happy that another class can do something better than they can. It also, I think, will clarify some what strengths of casters are in Pathfinder 2e. So if you want to see that sooner, my Patreon gives you 7-day early access to most of my videos, and I'm going to get that one done as soon as possible. Also, I plan to have a live stream with players from the campaign I shared a clip from, and this was their reaction when I brought up this idea, and again, this was before the current controversy.
This would be good content to chat with this particular group. The thumbnail is casters are not weak.
Oh, no, for sure not. No.
You also might be interested in my video I did a year and a half ago now, asking whether Pathfinder over-nerfed casters. I had done an experiment on my Discord pitting 4 martial characters and 4 casters who went through the same gauntlet of challenges and then had a PvP fight. The results of that experiment I talk about in the video. If you haven't yet, join the great community at my Discord where people answer your questions on Pathfinder and people meet up to organize games of the beginner box, and also we have a drop-in organized play system where you can take your character from adventure to adventure and gain levels and loot. And as always, if you enjoyed the video, please like and subscribe, and also ring the bell for my upcoming live stream. And that's it. I've been Ronald the Rules Lawyer, and thank you for watching.